biodiversity is incredibly complex. A lot of it, you can't just knock over a patch of bush that's pristine and hope to recreate it elsewhere. They're just too complicated. That's the first problem. The second problem is you've got a tree that's 500 years old, a nice old eucalypt full of hollows that is necessary for a whole host of wildlife. You bowl that over. How do you replace a tree that's 500 years old by planting another tree?
Phil Sparks says the survival of a host of woodland plants and animals depends on large forest remnants, which are much more resilient to impacts like climate change. Laird State Forest contains one of Australia's last large patches of old-growth white box grassy woodland.
We're in an area that's immediately adjoining where they're starting construction for the new Whitehaven mine. An area of white box woodland, which is the critically endangered ecological community. It's been reduced down to 0.1% of its original extent.
This white box grassy woodland?
Yeah. It's been overcleared very much, and areas in good condition such as this are very rare.
White box grassy woodland was heavily cleared for farming, its existence a sign of good soil. It's now down to the last of the last. There's virtually none in national parks, and much of what is left is in fragments, in stock routes and on roadsides, and is being invaded by weeds. Background Briefing understands staff from the New South Wales Office of Environment and Heritage identified Laird State Forest as irreplaceable, but were overruled when the state gave the mine its blessing. Here's Phil Spark.
Even though this forest was logged for many years, it was only logged in the areas where there's narrow-leafed ironbark and white cypress. So the box woodland areas are actually mature old growth. So the number of tree hollows is incredibly high. There are over 100 per hectare. Yeah, those big mature trees, like we're just looking at some there now, there'd be 5 or 6 hollows in each tree. Small ones suitable for bats and reptiles, and the large ones suitable for cockatoos and owls and the larger animals.
This forest supports 28 threatened species, especially bats and woodland birds, and is potential habitat for the swift parrot and the regent honeyeater, now believed to be down to the last few hundred individuals. Phil Spark has also found an endangered plant in an area marked up for clearing, a plant missed in Whitehaven Coal's environmental assessment.
They've marked it all up. It's obviously going to be cleared quite soon. And this little Tylophora linearis, which is a little twiner that twines itself around other shrubs, it hasn't even been considered.
A Whitehaven Coal report says it will conduct pre-clearing surveys and translocate any plants found. Critical in approving the mine are the offsets, properties which Whitehaven has bought and has to manage as conservation estates. There's nearly 10,000 hectares in those offsets, a far greater size than what's being cleared. The properties are supposed to protect the same sort of vegetation and habitat that will be lost in Laird State Forest, like for like. But Phil Spark says the size and good condition of white box grassy woodland in Laird makes it near impossible to offset.
They just think that they can simplistically purchase other properties that will supposedly compensate for this loss, which is not the case, and which is what we're going to actually explain a bit more today.
The Maules Creek mine offsets are in several locations. At the heart of this controversy is the amount of critically endangered boxgum grassy woodland on those offset sites. Whitehaven Coal's own offset plan says the vast bulk of this community is on just 2 properties, Mount Lindsay and Wirradale. So Phil Spark drove Background Briefing there for a look.
We've just come into the offset property of Mount Lindsay.
On Mount Lindsay, Phil Spark has walked more than half the area the mining company's consultant mapped as critically endangered boxgum woodland, and he says there are huge discrepancies, not only in areas mapped as white box, but other vegetation types as well.
Righto, so we've just come across the road and into an area that's been mapped as critically endangered ecological community of Manna-gum, yellowbox, Blakely's red gum open forest. This community we've found to be completely wrong. It's based on Manna-gum being present, and it's not present at all.
We then walk to another site, marked on the mine's offset map as a critically endangered white box community.
We're now into an area that is supposedly the white box, stringy bark, grassy woodland, and we're looking around us right now and we see a dominance of stringy bark, probably 80% stringy bark, and it's not white box at all. Even if that was white box, it still wouldn't be the community, because if you look around and look at the shrub layer that we have around us here, it's a continuous shrub layer. No white box woodland community that fits the description actually has a shrub layer.
Now, Phil Spark, how do we know that just over the ridge here there's not the beginnings of a large area of beautiful white box?
Well, we've walked extensively around 6 areas mapped as critically endangered ecological community of box gum woodland. So we've covered a good cross-section of it. We haven't covered all of the areas on Wirradale and Mount Lindsay, so we're not saying that there isn't some critically endangered ecological community on those properties, but what we have proven is that those 6 large remnants, they do not fit the criteria, and it is a sufficiently large enough area that raises very serious questions about all the vegetation mapping.
Phil Spark says we, because there's now 4 ecologists who've volunteered their time to review these offset sites and found them seriously lacking. Dr John Hunter is a botanist and vegetation mapper who specialises in local critically endangered communities. He's also helped develop offset plans for other mines. Wendy Hawes sat on the expert panel that wrote the condition criteria used to identify boxgum grassy woodlands, and she also wrote the draft National Recovery Plan for this critically endangered community. Between them, they have half a century of experience mapping and identifying vegetation in this region. Wendy Hawes went to the mine's 2 largest offset properties and studied 4 areas mapped by Whitehaven Coal as white box grassy woodland.
It doesn't contain grassy white box woodland, which is the endangered ecological community, the CEC. There are, within their offset areas, from our observations, small patches that could potentially meet the CECC, but they are very small areas, so they're a couple of hectares. They're nothing like the hectareage they're claiming. So the majority of the stuff that they're protecting is actually stringy bark communities, not white box.
And this is something that you can verify with the weight of your experience?
Yes.
Dr John Hunter has now investigated 1,600 hectares of Mount Lindsay and Wirradale, all of which is mapped as critically endangered boxgum woodland by Whitehaven Coal. He says his report is preliminary and the whole area needs to be thoroughly remapped. But on the basis of work so far, Dr Hunter says 95% of the Whitehaven offset mapping is wrong.
I think there's at maximum 5% of what they're saying is boxgum woodland there. The communities, they're not just stringy bark. All the dominants we found there are actually trees that they haven't listed as occurring there.
Like what kind of trees?
Well, stringy barks, New England blackbutt, orange gum, Bendemeer white gum. They're all trees that are dominating in this system, but they're not represented in the mapping.
So you're saying the maps are wrong?
The maps are patently wrong. They're just completely wrong.
Whitehaven Coal's offset plan was developed by environmental consultants Cumberland Ecology. The plan says there were field studies done to assess these offset areas. Background Briefing contacted Cumberland Ecology for an interview. Its director, Dr David Robertson, said his contract with Whitehaven Coal prevents him from speaking. Local ecologist Wendy Hawes says those field studies are wrong.
If they have been on site, they seriously didn't know what they were looking at.
Now, to the uninitiated, tell us how you can come to that conclusion.
Because the trees that we're talking about are quite distinctive, and if you're used to working in them, then you know what the community looks like, you know what the trees look like, you know when you're not in boxgum woodland.
Background Briefing contacted both the state and federal governments to find out if they did their own field surveys of the offset sites before approving the Maules Creek mine. The federal government admitted it did not. The state government provided no evidence it had surveyed the offset sites either. So both levels of government approved one of Australia's biggest new open-cut coal mines without any independent check of Whitehaven Coal's offset claims. With less and less good quality bushland left in Australia, finding an equivalent offset will only become more difficult, which is why developers are putting forward offsets that rely on restoring cleared farm paddocks or rehabilitating mine sites. Mining companies often claim that when a pit or a well is closed, the land is returned to its original state. But a man described as Australia's top restoration ecologist says that's just wrong. This is Richard Hobbs from the University of Western Australia.
And I think the problem up till now has been that people have seen ecological restoration as being a kind of magic bullet that'll come in and solve everything. And I think the response to that is, well, no, it's not.
This is the sound of Carnaby's black cockatoo, a threatened bird at the heart of an offset controversy that's worrying Richard Hobbs. Only a small proportion of the cockatoos left are young enough to breed, and they rely on the Banksia woodlands around Perth. Yet Richard Hobbs says 2 high-value remnants of Banksia woodland have been bulldozed recently, one which was listed to be protected.
Recently there's been several pieces of very nice Banksia woodland. One, in fact, was registered on the state's Bush Forever list as being of particular significance, that were cleared for development, one for a hospital, one for development around Jandakot Airport, which is the light plane airport in Perth.
Now it's back to Canberra, and a last example that particularly aggrieves one of the architects of offsetting in Australia. The ANU's Dr Phil Gibbons has brought background briefing to a boxgum woodland park on the city's northern edge. It's right next door to another block, scheduled to be cleared for a housing development.
And now we're standing in Watson Woodlands, or Justice Robert Hope Park, which has now been approved as an offset for a development just 10 metres away from us, which extends for 4 hectares.
Right, so that bit's going to be bulldozed over there, and I believe it has about 40 mature boxgum trees on it.
That's right, mature trees. They're looking at them, they might be up to 200 years old.
As Phil Gibbons surveys these adjoining sites, he says using Justice Robert Hope Park as an offset is simply wrong. He says the park only exists because of the hard work of local volunteers to restore the boxgum woodland over the past 12 years. Dr Gibbons says those conservation gains are not the work of the developer.
Let's remind ourselves about what offsets are about. A fair-minded person would agree that if a developer destroys some of Australia's natural capital in making a buck, all right, then they should really offset that impact elsewhere. Use some of their profits to offset that impact on our natural capital elsewhere.
When background briefing contacted both the ACT and Commonwealth governments, they both said the volunteers' work has not been taken into consideration in approving this offset. But Dr Phil Gibbons begs to differ. He helped develop the offset calculator used in this decision. He's gone back over the paperwork and crunched the numbers again, and found that the approval does claim conservation gains made by local volunteers.
But if you look at their actual calculations, they have in fact used the community's goodwill since 2002 in calculating those gains. So in other words, every tree you see in this site that's been planted by the community is contributing to the loss of a tree next door. The community's not going to sign up for that if they know that that's what their work is contributing to.
Phil Gibbons then lists off several other reasons where this offset approval has gone awry, including a pivotal assumption that the park is not properly protected. It's zoned urban open space. So the argument goes that the park is in grave danger of being turned into a suburb, and the boxgum woodland lost if it wasn't declared an offset. Phil Gibbons says that argument is rubbish.
The offset calculator assumes that this site here has a 70% chance, if it wasn't set aside as an offset, it was likely to be destroyed anyway for urban development. And that's plainly wrong. I've calculated that the risk that this site would have been destroyed without it being an offset is actually below 1%.
Now look, this is a tiny little site here. It's only 16 hectares over there and 4 hectares over here. Why should we really be bothered?
Di, you've got to remember, this is a critically endangered ecological community. Only 5% of the original distribution, when When Europeans came to Australia, there was 95% more of this stuff, right? 5% left. I did some research to show that half of this ecological community is now in patches less than 2 hectares. We're standing here with a 20-hectare patch of boxgum grassy woodland. It's one of the biggest left in the country. It's a big patch of boxgum grassy woodland, okay? So you say that this is only a small patch. It's death by 1,000 cuts, all right? You knock off this, you do it over the whole country, and before you know it, this stuff's gone. And every single species that rely on it's gone too.